Hi there, and welcome back to Lean Reads, the channel where we share powerful insights and personal growth lessons through great books. Why are some countries rich while others stay poor? It's not luck, it's not geography, it's the system. This book, Why Nations Fail, reveals how power decides everything: who gets rich, who stays trapped, and who dares to change the rules. If you enjoy what you hear and want to dive deeper, we've included a link to the book in the description below. Now, let's get started. Why are some nations trapped in cycles of poverty, while others achieve lasting prosperity? Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson tackles one of humanity's oldest and most fundamental questions, and delivers an answer that challenges centuries of conventional wisdom. The authors argue that the true roots of wealth and poverty lie not in geography, culture, or even natural resources, but in the political and economic institutions that societies build and how those institutions distribute power. Prosperous nations, they contend, are built on inclusive institutions that encourage participation, innovation, and fairness. Failing nations, by contrast, are suffocated by extractive institutions, systems that concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few, stifling creativity and preventing broad-based growth. Through sweeping historical examples, from the Roman Empire to modern China, from the Glorious Revolution to the Congo, Acemoglu and Robinson reveal a consistent pattern. Nations rise when they empower their people, and they fall when power is hoarded. Daron Acemoglu, born 1967, is an MIT professor of economics, widely regarded as one of the most influential economists of his generation. He is a recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal, often considered a precursor to the Nobel Prize, recognizing his groundbreaking research on institutions and political economy. James A. Robinson, born 1960, is a political scientist and economist at Harvard University, specializing in comparative politics and development. His extensive fieldwork in Latin America and Africa gives this book its remarkable depth and realism. Together, Acemoglu and Robinson combine rigorous theory with historical insight to uncover how nations' fates are shaped, not by chance, but by choice. Throughout history, human progress has never been evenly distributed. While some societies evolve toward freedom, innovation, and prosperity, others remain trapped in repression and stagnation. According to Acemoglu and Robinson, the key lies in institutional design, the invisible architecture that determines who holds power, how wealth is created and shared, who can participate in shaping the nation's future. When institutions are inclusive, they foster stability, creativity, and sustainable growth. When they are extractive, they breed inequality, corruption, and decay. This framework explains why the same technologies, ideas, or resources can produce geography, culture, and ignorance. Why they don't explain prosperity. The wealth or poverty of a nation cannot be explained solely by geography, culture, or education. In some places, just a few steps separate two completely different realities of human life. The divided town of Nogales illustrates this vividly. Straddling the border between the United States and Mexico, Nogales is split by a steel fence. On one side lies Nogales, Arizona, American territory, where people enjoy better schools, healthcare, safety, and incomes roughly 3 times higher than their neighbors just a few hundred meters away. In Nogales, Sonora, on the Mexican side, same people, same language, same climate, even similar traditions, and yet two entirely different worlds. The puzzle of prosperity. This striking contrast raises one of humanity's biggest questions. What truly determines the wealth or poverty of nations? Could it be geography, as proposed by the French philosopher Montesquieu in the 18th century? He argued that tropical climates bred laziness and lower productivity, while temperate climates encouraged industriousness and discipline. Over time, this theory evolved into modern geographical determinism, emphasizing factors like disease, soil fertility, and natural barriers, often used to explain the struggles of Africa, Central America, or South Asia. But if geography alone were destiny, then both sides of Nogales should look the same. The myth of geography and the lesson of divided nations. Nogales is not an isolated case. Look at the Korean Peninsula, split in two after the war. The North descended into poverty and totalitarian control, while the South rose to become one of the world's most advanced economies. Or consider East and West Germany before reunification, or the contrasting paths of Botswana, Singapore, and Malaysia, nations that defied the limits of their geography to achieve extraordinary growth. If geography were truly decisive, these examples would be impossible. The cultural argument and why it fails. Another popular explanation is the cultural hypothesis. In the early 20th century, German sociologist Max Weber argued that the Protestant work ethic drove Western Europe's economic success. Yet the Korean example dismantles this idea as well. North and South Korea share the same cultural heritage, language, and traditions, yet their economic destinies diverged dramatically. Culture remained constant. The only real change was the system, their political and economic institutions. The ignorance hypothesis. Do leaders simply not know better? A third explanation blames failure on ignorance. The idea that poor nations remain poor because their leaders make bad economic choices out of incompetent institutions, the true engine behind prosperity and poverty. When we look at the stark differences in living standards between nations, it's easy to be distracted by complex explanations, geography, culture, or history. But beneath all those surface layers lies something far more decisive, yet often invisible: institutions. It's not the soil, the weather, or the natural resources that determine prosperity. It is the rules and structures that govern how a society works. The power of economic institutions. Every nation operates within a unique institutional framework, a set of laws, norms, and organizations that define how people produce, exchange, own, and distribute wealth. When those rules encourage participation, protect private property, ensure access to finance and education, and reward innovation, we call them inclusive economic institutions. Inclusive systems open the door for everyone to contribute and to benefit from their efforts. People work hard and innovate because they believe the fruits of their labor are protected by law and recognized by society. This faith in fairness and opportunity forms the invisible foundation of prosperous nations like South Korea or the United States. The trap of extractive systems. But when the rules are written to serve the interests of a narrow elite, when wealth and power are systematically extracted from the many to benefit the few. The result is an extractive institution. In such systems, economic motivation collapses. Why innovate if your success can be seized at any moment? Why work harder if your reward will be stolen? From the forced labor systems of colonial Latin America to the rigid state control of North Korea, extractive institutions suffocate initiative and entrench poverty. They create societies built not on opportunity, but on fear and dependency, the political foundation of prosperity. Economic systems, however, do not exist in isolation. Behind every economic structure lies a political one, the true root of prosperity or decline. A nation can only sustain inclusive economic institutions if it also has inclusive political institutions, systems where power is shared, checked, and accountable. In inclusive political orders, authority is distributed among diverse social groups. Citizens have representation. No single person or clique can dominate decision making indefinitely. Yet this does not mean chaos or anarchy. For any system to function effectively, some degree of centralization is essential, especially to uphold the rule of law. It is the delicate balance between pluralism and centralization that gives rise to stability and fairness. No one stands above the law, but neither does power become fragmented beyond control. Why balance matters when political power is shared? Society gains a built in mechanism of self correction. Groups can restrain one another, preventing policies that serve only the elite. Instead, leaders are compelled to design rules that benefit the majority, fostering development, competition, and opportunity. This equilibrium explains why inclusive nations tend to grow sustainably over time, while extractive ones stagnate or implode. The interplay between political inclusiveness and economic inclusiveness is what fuels long term progress or ensures decline. Institutions as the invisible engine of history. Institutions are not abstract theories. They are the real forces that propel or paralyze entire civilizations. They determine whether ambition is rewarded or punished, whether creativity thrives or dies, whether nations rise or fall. The fate of every country ultimately hinges on the same question: do its institutions empower the many or protect the few? Because in the end, the difference between prosperity and poverty is not luck, it is design. Institutions are the invisible architecture of nations. They decide who holds power, how it's used, and whether that power builds or destroys. How singular events shaped divergent institutional paths. The formation of political and economic institutions around the world has never followed a smooth or predictable path. Sometimes, entire histories are reshaped not by long term strategies or deliberate reforms, but by a single event occurring at just the right moment. These moments, what Acemoglu and Robinson call critical junctures, act as turning points that redirect the trajectory of nations, setting them on paths that can diverge for centuries to come. The Black Death, a tragedy that redefined power. In the mid 14th century, Europe was struck by one of the most devastating catastrophes in human history, the Black Death. Carried along the trade routes from the east, the plague ravaged towns and countrysides alike, killing nearly half of Europe's population. But beyond the unimaginable human cost, the Black Death unleashed a seismic institutional shift. Before the plague, medieval Europe operated under a feudal order, a rigid, extractive hierarchy. Kings granted land to nobles in exchange for loyalty, while peasants worked the land without ownership or autonomy, bound to estates. They paid crushing taxes and had no legal right to leave. In this system, the many served the few, and labor existed solely to sustain the elite. Then, the plague upended everything. As millions died, labor became scarce, and power subtly began to shift toward those who had always been powerless. When labor became leverage, in Western Europe, the severe shortage of workers forced the lords to make concessions. Peasants began to demand and receive lower rents, greater mobility, and the right to negotiate. For the first time, a degree of bargaining between social classes emerged within a feudal world that had long rejected it. This fragile shift laid the groundwork for more inclusive institutions, expanding freedom and economic opportunity. But in Eastern Europe, the story unfolded differently. There, the peasantry lacked organization and collective power. Instead of liberalization, the local aristocracy tightened its grip, increasing taxes, restricting movement, and reinforcing serfdom. Out of the same plague, two regions with similar cultures and histories embarked on radically different institutional paths. This phenomenon is known as institutional drift, the gradual divergence of societies when a critical event magnifies existing differences in power and organization. The next turning point, trade, colonization, and opportunity. Centuries later, another major critical juncture arrived, the age of exploration and the rise of global trade. As new trade routes opened and colonies were established in the Americas, enormous wealth flowed into Europe. Yet not all nations benefited equally. Those with inclusive political systems, such as England, were positioned to harness this new wealth. Their institutions, with checks on royal power and protection for property rights, enabled merchants, inventors, and entrepreneurs to thrive. By contrast, countries with extractive elites, such as Spain or many in Eastern Europe, funneled the new wealth into the hands of a few, reinforcing old hierarchies and stifling innovation. The result was a widening institutional gap, one that would determine who would lead the Industrial Revolution and who would be left behind. Chance, power, and the long arc of history, from deadly pandemics to global trade booms, history shows that chance events often act as mirrors, reflecting deeper structural truths. They expose who holds power, how that power is used, and whether societies can adapt or entrench themselves. While geography or culture may shape the backdrop, it is institutions and the way they evolve during these critical moments that ultimately determine the destiny of nations. History is not shaped by fate, but by how societies respond when fate gives them a choice. The origins of prosperity in the early industrial nations. The rise of Britain as the world's first industrial power was no accident. Behind the roaring factories, the global trade routes, and the wealth of the 19th century lay a slow and deliberate institutional evolution, a centuries-long process in which power with shared law was strengthened and faith in private property took root. Industrial prosperity, it turns out, did not begin with steam engines or coal mines. It began with rules, rights, and representation. From Magna Carta to the birth of Parliament, the seeds of pluralistic governance in England were planted early. In 1215, the Magna Carta, a charter forced upon King John by his barons, became the first legal document to limit the authority of the crown. Though rudimentary, it marked a historic precedent. Even monarchs were not above the law. Centuries later, this tension between monarchy and society reached its defining moment in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. With Parliament's backing, William III ascended the throne, replacing James II, who had sought to restore absolute royal power. In exchange, Parliament gained unprecedented authority, permanently weakening the monarchy's dominance. This revolution was not merely political theater, it was an institutional reset. It established the foundations of a government where decisions were no longer dictated by a single ruler, but negotiated among powerful social groups. While the franchise remained limited to landowners, these elites, as key economic actors, had every incentive to create inclusive economic institutions, laws that protected property, rewarded enterprise, and encouraged trade, financial innovation, and the architecture of capitalism. The institutional transformation quickly gave rise to financial modernization. In 1694, the Bank of England was founded not only to finance the government, but also to extend credit to merchants and entrepreneurs. Reforms to the tax system soon followed. Rather than taxing production directly, as with the infamous hearth tax, the government began to levy taxes on land and consumption. This shift improved efficiency and allowed revenues to be reinvested in infrastructure and public projects. By the late 18th century, Britain's landscape was changing dramatically. Canals were dug, roads were paved, and the railway network began to take shape, all designed to serve the growing needs of commerce and industry, factories, trade, and the feedback loop of growth. Industrialization soon gathered unstoppable momentum. Factories emerged, pioneering mass production techniques that cut costs and raised productivity. British goods flooded world markets. The profits from trade and exports were taxed, reinvested, and recycled back into the domestic economy, fueling a self-sustaining cycle of growth. In this process, capitalism matured, not as a mere economic model, but as a byproduct of political evolution. Britain's prosperity, however, was not defined solely by material wealth. Its deeper achievement lay in the mutual reinforcement between open economics and open politics, what Acemoglu and Robinson describe as a virtuous circle. The virtuous circle of inclusion. In Britain, inclusive political institutions gave rise to inclusive economic institutions, which in turn produced prosperity, and prosperity, in turn, strengthened political inclusion. Each element supported the other, creating a cycle that would define modern democracy and capitalism alike. It was a system where laws protected citizens rather than rulers, where innovation was rewarded rather than punished, and where the fruits of progress though still unevenly distributed, were built upon participation, not exploitation. This was the true revolution of Britain, not the sound of machines in Manchester, but the quiet triumph of institutions that made those machines possible. Steam powered the engines, but institutions powered the revolution. How inclusive institutions create virtuous circles. When a society succeeds in building inclusive institutions, both political and economic, a remarkable chain reaction begins. These systems do not simply generate growth, they sustain and strengthen themselves over time. They form what Acemoglu and Robinson call virtuous circles, self reinforcing loops in which social forces, political accountability, and free media continually check, balance, and refine one another. Britain's expanding circle of inclusion. The story of Britain illustrates this dynamic vividly. After pluralistic political institutions took root, waves of social and economic change followed. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, power gradually expanded beyond the landed elite. What began as a privilege reserved for the aristocracy evolved, step by step, into a universal right to vote, first for working class men and eventually for women. This transformation did not emerge from the generosity of the ruling class. It was won through struggle, through strikes, protests, petitions, and decades of collective action by those long excluded from power. But Britain's institutions were designed with an unusual resilience. They favored compromise over repression. The elites, seeking to preserve social stability and their own economic gains, found it rational to concede. By yielding some power, they safeguarded the very system that sustained their prosperity. Thus emerged a delicate equilibrium, a mutual surveillance mechanism between rulers and citizens. The public demanded representation. The elite required stability. The result was a political system that grew more inclusive, not by revolution, but by negotiation. Economic fairness as a natural consequence. Political inclusion naturally set the stage for economic inclusion. When power is no longer monopolized, the laws governing property, credit, labor, and trade must also become fairer and more transparent. The state could no longer exist as the protector of privilege. It had to become a representative guardian of the public interest. The process was gradual and imperfect, but relentless, driven in part by a new and powerful institution, the press, the media, as the mirror of power. The rise of journalism was not merely a byproduct of democracy, it was one of its engines. By exposing corruption investigating abuses and amplifying public demands. The press functioned as society's mirror, reflecting its realities, its injustices, and its progress. With information flowing freely, rulers could be held accountable, voters could make informed choices, and decisions could no longer be hidden behind closed doors. This transparency acted as a catalyst, ensuring that institutional reform did not stagnate, but evolved with society's needs. Across the Atlantic, America's progressive awakening, a similar virtuous circle unfolded across the Atlantic at the dawn of the 20th century, as massive corporations like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel consolidated unprecedented economic power. The United States faced the risk of becoming a plutocracy, a nation ruled by monopolies rather than laws. Yet between 1901 and 1921, three U.S. presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, took decisive action. They enforced antitrust laws, broke up monopolies, and restored the principle of open competition. These reforms did not emerge spontaneously. They were ignited by the power of investigative journalism, the muckrakers of the progressive era. Their exposés of corporate greed and political corruption stirred public outrage, mobilized civic movements, and forced political leaders to act. This was a textbook example of the virtuous circle in motion. Power concentrated in the few. When power becomes the enemy of prosperity. Throughout history, power has been both the foundation and the downfall of nations. Created to maintain order and stability, political power often transforms into the very force that suffocates innovation and economic progress. When rulers prioritize the preservation of their authority over the prosperity of their people, they inevitably turn against change, even when that change promises growth, knowledge, and national renewal. This fear of losing control has halted more revolutions than any external enemy ever could. The printing press, a revolution forbidden. One of the most striking examples of power resisting progress comes from the story of the printing press. Invented in Mainz, Germany, around 1445, Gutenberg's press spread rapidly across Europe to Strasbourg, Florence, Rome, London, and Krakow, unleashing a tidal wave of literacy, ideas, and enlightenment. But in the Ottoman Empire, this same invention was banned. Ottoman rulers perceived the press not as a tool of learning, but as a threat to control. They feared that printed books would spread dissenting ideas, challenge religious authority, and ignite social awakening. Printing in Arabic, the empire's primary language, was outlawed completely. It wasn't until 1727, nearly 3 centuries later, that the ban was partially lifted, and even then, strict censorship remained. Every text required the approval of religious scholars and the state before it could be printed. The consequences were devastating. While literacy rates in England reached 40–60%, only 2–3% of the Ottoman population could read. This was not merely an educational gap, it was a knowledge divide that symbolized who had access to information and who didn't. The result was an empire intellectually isolated, left behind as Europe surged ahead into modernity. Austria-Hungary and the fear of creative destruction. Another vivid illustration comes from Central Europe in the early 19th century. Emperor Francis I of Austria-Hungary viewed technological change not as opportunity, but as danger. He feared what economist Joseph Schumpeter would later call creative destruction. The idea that innovation inevitably dismantles old industries while creating new ones. Instead of embracing industrialization, Francis I outlawed machinery in 1811, even restricting the development of railways, the very symbol of the industrial age. Behind this resistance lay a deeper fear that modernization would erode the power of traditional elites who upheld the monarchy. If mechanized production displaced the old artisan guilds and textile families, the empire's social order might collapse. For Francis I, protecting the political hierarchy mattered more than prosperity, and so progress was sacrificed at the altar of stability. A nation left behind, while other European nations turned to coal, a far more efficient energy source. Austria clung to charcoal. By 1883, when 90% of the world's iron was smelted with coal, the Austro-Hungarian Empire still relied on outdated techniques. Its textile industry, once the pride of the region, lagged far behind the mechanized factories of Britain and France. By the end of World War I, as the empire disintegrated, its economy looked like a relic from another century, a vivid reminder of how fear of change can turn even the most powerful states into prisoners of their own authority. The paradox of power. The lesson is as simple as it is sobering. Unchecked power is the enemy of progress. When political leaders perceive innovation as a threat rather than an opportunity, they stifle not only growth, but also the very creativity that sustains civilization. The more they tighten their grip, the more their societies stagnate. Economic failure, then, is not born of ignorance, but of insecurity. Those in power often know what must be done. They simply refuse to do it because true reform requires them to share the control they fear to lose. In the end, nations do not fail because their people lack intelligence or ambition. They fail because their rulers fear the future. The Ottomans banned the printing press. Austria resisted industrialization. Across centuries and continents, the pattern repeats. Where power concentrates, progress halts. Innovation demands risk, openness, and adaptation, qualities that absolute rulers find intolerable. And thus, history's greatest tragedies are not those of poverty alone, but of potential wasted, when fear of change outweighs the promise of growth. The enduring legacy of extractive institutions. Extractive institutions, though condemned, resisted, and overthrown, rarely disappear without a trace. They leave behind deep scars etched into the social and political fabric of nations. Born from historical contingencies, they survive long after their original circumstances fade, sustained by the very power structures they once created. The slave trade, a global cycle of exploitation. One of the most enduring and destructive legacies of extractive systems is slavery. While European colonial powers infamously expanded the transatlantic slave trade in the 17th century, slavery had already existed in Africa for centuries. When European empires sought vast labor forces for the sugar plantations of the New World, they discovered a grim opportunity, a ready-made market for human lives. Local rulers, seeing profit in captivity, began capturing prisoners of war or common criminals to sell as slaves. In many regions, enslavement became the default punishment for any transgression. This exchange was not one-sided. In return for slaves and raw materials such as cotton, European merchants supplied firearms, fueling warfare among African kingdoms. The continent descended into a vicious cycle, violence begetting profit, profit feeding more violence. Even after the transatlantic slave trade was formally abolished in 1807, the practice endured in new forms. Slavery went underground, embedded in the domestic economy. Now, instead of being shipped across oceans, slaves were forced to labor for local elites, serving the internal market and export industries. Exploitation simply changed its face, but never its essence. The colonial legacy, from empire to independence. When African nations gained independence in the mid 20th century, many hoped the dawn of freedom would also bring economic and political renewal. But the reality proved far harsher. The institutions built by colonial powers, designed to extract wealth and enforce obedience, did not vanish. They persisted, repackaged under the language of national sovereignty. Take Sierra Leone, a British colony from the early 19th century until 1961. The British had governed the region through a system of paramount chiefs, local rulers, handpicked to administer villages on behalf of the crown. Even today, these chiefs retain lifetime authority, chosen by a narrow circle of hereditary families. Democratic elections scarcely exist within this framework. The ordinary people remain without a voice. Political independence, in this sense, merely transferred control, not transformed it. The same vertical power structure endured, cloaked in national colors. Economic chains that never broke. Economic exploitation followed the same pattern. In 1949, the British established the Sierra Leone Produce Marketing Board, ostensibly to protect farmers from price fluctuations. In reality, it became a tool of silent taxation. Instead of supporting producers, the board underpaid farmers, siphoning off nearly half their income. By the mid 1960s, when independence arrived, the system remained intact. And under Prime Minister Shaka Stevens, it grew even more oppressive. By the 1970s, farmers were forced to surrender up to 90% of their earnings, a new form of feudalism disguised as modern governance. This was not stagnation by accident, it was extraction by design. The same elite networks that had served colonial rulers now served themselves. They retained the mechanisms of control, taxes, monopolies, and patronage, while replacing only the faces at the top. Why extraction endures. The persistence of extractive institutions reveals a harsh truth. Once established, power protects itself. These systems endure not because they are efficient, but because they are effective at one thing: preserving dominance. Their leaders may change titles, languages, or flags, but the underlying logic remains. A small elite benefits at the expense of the many. Even after independence, the colonizers' pyramid of control continues to stand, simply painted in national colors, a legacy that outlives its creators. The tragedy of extraction is that it reproduces itself. It breeds inequality, resentment, and corruption, the perfect soil for its own survival. The institutions that once enforced colonial rule now enforce domestic tyranny. And so, history repeats itself, not as fate, but as a structure of power too entrenched to die easily. The question that remains is not why these systems were created, that is already known, but why they did not collapse. What mechanisms allow exploitation to regenerate across generations? What invisible armor protects those who hold power from accountability? These questions lead us to the next chapter, where the cycle of domination reveals its most resilient form, the self-perpetuating equilibrium of extractive power. Empires may fall, but the architecture of exploitation often survives them, rebuilt brick by brick by those who inherit its throne. How extractive institutions create a vicious circle of poverty. When power ceases to serve the people and becomes a tool of control, extractive institutions are born, and once they take root, they rarely disappear. Instead, they evolve, refining themselves, embedding deeper into society, creating a vicious circle where poverty, inequality, and oppression perpetuate not because of ignorance or inefficiency, but by deliberate design, power, control, and the fear of losing authority. Every extractive system begins with a single motive to preserve power, but over time, the desire to rule becomes self reinforcing. Once political or economic control concentrates in the hands of a few, those few will do whatever it takes to keep it, even if it means suffocating progress or prosperity. The story of the post slavery American South illustrates this perfectly. After the abolition of slavery in 1865, one might have expected the end of racial hierarchy, but the old elites, white landowners who had ruled through chains, now turned to the law. Legal codes replaced shackles. Black citizens, newly granted the right to vote, were faced with poll taxes, literacy tests, and bureaucratic traps designed to exclude them. These measures appeared neutral on paper, but were precisely engineered to maintain white dominance. Decades of deprivation and illiteracy made it almost impossible for freed slaves to meet the arbitrary requirements of citizenship. In this way, the South reinvented bondage under the guise of legality. Oppression became institutionalized, woven into schools, hospitals, transport, and every sphere of daily life. The Jim Crow laws, which codified racial segregation from the late 19th to mid 20th centuries, ensured that freedom existed only in name. Political and economic power stayed firmly in the same hands. The African parallel, independence without liberation. This pattern is far from unique to the United States. Across Africa, the end of colonialism did not dissolve extractive institutions, it transferred them. The leaders who inherited power often used the same machinery of control left behind by their colonizers, this time for their own benefit. In Sierra Leone, President Shaka Stevens became a textbook example. Elected amid hopes of national renewal, he consolidated absolute authority and weaponized the weak political system to crush opposition. When the Mende people, an ethnic group that supported his political rivals, began gaining influence, Stevens retaliated, not with reform, but with economic sabotage. He dismantled the railway connecting Mende territories to export ports, an act that crippled their local economy. This seemingly technical decision was, in truth, a political weapon, a way to punish dissent and entrench his dominance. Stevens grew stronger, but the nation grew weaker. Each policy decision reinforced the same logic: weaken the people to strengthen the ruler. The iron law of oligarchy. The German sociologist Robert Michels called this dynamic the iron law of oligarchy. His insight was stark. Any organization, once power is centralized, inevitably becomes dominated by a small elite, regardless of its founding ideals. Even movements born from liberation, equality, or revolution eventually reproduce the very hierarchies they sought to destroy. The machinery of exploitation adapts. Where once it was monarchy, it becomes a one-party state. Where once it was slavery, it becomes wage dependency. Where once it was empire, it becomes nationalism, hollowed of substance. The names change, the faces change, but the structure of control endures. The engine of enduring poverty. In such systems, poverty is not an accident. It is an instrument of governance. Keeping the majority poor ensures dependence. Dependence ensures obedience, and obedience guarantees stability for those at the top. Thus, the vicious circle spins. Extractive institutions create inequality. Inequality reinforces the power of the few. The powerful rewrite the rules to preserve their dominance. Reform becomes impossible without revolution. This self-perpetuating mechanism explains why some nations remain trapped in stagnation for centuries, not because they lack resources or intellect, but because their systems are built to prevent change. In extractive societies, poverty is not a failure of policy, it is the policy itself. From the Jim Crow South to post-colonial Africa, the pattern is unmistakable. When institutions serve the few, they enslave the many through law, economy, or fear. Each generation inherits not only the suffering of the last, but the architecture that sustains it. Breaking this circle requires more than economic reform. It demands a redistribution of power, the courage to dismantle the very institutions that built the nation. The illusion of growth. Under extractive institutions, economic growth can flourish under extractive institutions, but it never lasts. Beneath impressive numbers lies a fragile foundation, a system driven by coercion, not creativity, discipline, not dynamism. Growth achieved through fear and force may dazzle the world for a time, but it always collapses under its own weight. The Soviet Union stands as the clearest case in modern history, a superpower that rose with breathtaking speed only to decay from within. The Soviet miracle, progress by command. From its founding through the 1970s, the Soviet Union achieved feats that seemed nothing short of miraculous. It became the first nation to send a human being into space. Between 1928 and 1960, its economy grew by an average of 6% per year, transforming a largely agrarian society into an industrial giant. To a world still reeling from the Great Depression, Soviet achievements appeared to prove that a centrally planned authoritarian system could rival, even surpass, capitalist democracies. From Moscow's vantage point, the future seemed predictable and bright. Production quotas were met, cities expanded, and steel and concrete symbolized modernity itself. But this success was built not on innovation, but on mobilization, the forced redirection of resources from agriculture to heavy industry. Millions of peasants were uprooted and collectivized. Output increased because the state demanded it, not because citizens desired or discovered better ways to work. There was no private ownership, no genuine incentives, and no tolerance for dissent. In such an environment, creativity, the lifeblood of sustainable progress, could not survive. Fear replaced curiosity, and obedience replaced ambition. The limits of forced progress, as long as there were idle resources to mobilize, land to seize, peasants to conscript, factories to build. Growth continued, but once the low-hanging fruit was gone, the engine began to stall. The Soviet system lacked what economists call creative destruction, the constant renewal that occurs when new technologies replace the old. In extractive regimes, creative destruction is seen as heresy. Innovation threatens entrenched power. It shifts wealth, alters hierarchies, and empowers new actors, all of which autocrats fear. Thus, The very mechanism that sustains prosperity in inclusive economies becomes a mortal threat under extractive ones. When reform was attempted, the contradictions of the system became painfully visible. In 1956, the Soviet government introduced a policy to reward innovations that improved productivity, but bonuses were tied to the total wage bill, meaning that if a factory adopted a labor saving invention, its payroll shrank and it lost the bonus. A reform meant to encourage innovation ended up punishing it. The system sabotaged itself by design, power, paranoia, and decline. Within the ruling elite, another dynamic was at play, one even more corrosive. Power in the Soviet Union was synonymous with privilege. As a result, factions within the Communist Party constantly vied for influence, not over ideas, but over access to resources, contracts, housing, and protection. Politics turned into an endless game of suspicion and purges. Loyalty mattered more than competence, conformity more than creativity. Economic policy became not a tool of national development, but a weapon in the struggle for survival among elites. By the 1970s, productivity had stagnated. Factories kept producing, but often goods no one wanted. The system could not correct itself because criticism equaled disloyalty. And in a world that was rapidly digitizing and globalizing, stagnation was a death sentence, the anatomy of unsustainable growth. The Soviet story reveals a deeper truth. Extractive systems can command growth, but they cannot create it. They can build rockets and factories, but not curiosity or entrepreneurship. They can mobilize people, but not motivate them. Growth born from coercion lacks resilience. When pressure fades or resources run out, decline is inevitable. It is the difference between a steam engine fueled by fear and a living ecosystem fueled by freedom. Authoritarian regimes can build monuments to power, but never foundations for progress. In the short term, extractive institutions can achieve miracles. In the long term, they destroy the very human potential that makes prosperity possible. The Soviet Union, like many regimes before and after it, mistook control for strength and paid the price of its own design. Its downfall was not the failure of communism alone, but of every system that believes progress can be ordered by decree. For growth without inclusion is merely expansion without evolution, a fire that burns bright, then burns out. Breaking the vicious circle of poverty, difficult, but not impossible. Breaking the vicious circle of poverty is one of humanity's most difficult challenges, but it is not impossible. Throughout history, nations have fallen into the trap of extractive institutions, systems where power is concentrated in the hands of a few and wealth is distributed with ruthless inequality. Yet history, heavy as it is not a life sentence. It does not dictate destiny, and most importantly, even in the bleakest circumstances, inclusive institutions, those that encourage broad participation and protect the rights of many, can emerge and transform societies. How? Change begins. The power of historical turning points. Institutional change rarely comes from good intentions alone. It is born in moments of upheaval, historical turning points when existing power structures crack under the weight of crisis or reform. The Black Death of the 14th century, for example, decimated Europe's population, but also weakened feudal hierarchies. Labor became scarce, giving peasants bargaining power for the first time. Across Western Europe, This shock helped dismantle feudalism, paving the way for a rising middle class and eventually the birth of capitalism, the soil in which inclusive economic institutions took root. In England, these shifts were not the result of a single reform or enlightened ruler. They were the outcome of centuries of struggle, negotiations, revolts, and compromises that slowly expanded political participation and laid the foundations of a more balanced power structure. From Jim Crow to justice, the American example. Even societies shackled by centuries of injustice can change course. The American South, once dominated by the institutionalized racism of the Jim Crow laws, is a powerful example. For nearly a century after the Civil War, Black Americans were denied political and economic agency. But in the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement broke through, driven not by elites, but by ordinary people, students, pastors, factory workers, and dreamers. Through peaceful protest, civil disobedience, and collective courage, they forced the dismantling of discriminatory laws and challenged the cultural foundations of segregation. Change was not quick nor complete, but it was real. It proved that inclusive institutions are not gifts, they are victories, the limits of foreign aid, and the power of empowerment. In today's globalized world, foreign aid is often seen as a tool to combat poverty. Yet history shows that when aid flows into extractive systems, it rarely helps the people who need it most. Instead, it strengthens the very elites who perpetuate inequality, giving them new resources to entrench their control. Pouring money into a corrupt system is like watering the weeds instead of the roots. Real progress requires more than funding, it requires empowerment. Aid must be directed toward building civic capacity, supporting grassroots movements, and giving marginalized groups the means to organize, question, and reclaim their agency. Brazil, a case study in democratic renewal. Brazil offers one of the most inspiring examples of how change can arise from within. During the late 20th century, under military dictatorship, the nation seemed trapped in an extractive cycle. But as repression deepened, civil society awakened. Trade unions, social movements, and community organizations united to demand democracy. By 1985, their collective pressure forced the collapse of the military regime. Less than 2 decades later, Brazil emerged as one of the fastest growing economies in the world, not because of sudden wealth, but because of inclusive participation. From 2000 to 2012, Brazil not only advanced economically, but also expanded political inclusiveness, increasing representation, reducing inequality, and investing in social programs that empowered the poor. It was proof that the chains of history can be broken when people organize, speak up, and are supported by systems that amplify their voice. The central message of why nations fail is both sobering and empowering. A nation's wealth or poverty is not predetermined by geography, culture, or ethnicity. The key lies in its institutions, the structures that determine how power is distributed, how property is protected, and who gets to participate in shaping the rules. Institutions are more than laws or bureaucracies. They are the operating systems of society, defining whether innovation is rewarded or punished, whether opportunities are open or hoarded. Inclusive institutions nurture innovation, investment, fair competition, and shared prosperity. Extractive institutions entrench privilege, suppress creativity, and breed stagnation. While history shapes institutions, it does not imprison them. With courage, persistence, and the right collective strategy, nations can rebuild the foundations of their systems, replacing exploitation with inclusion, fear with accountability, and stagnation with innovation. Breaking the vicious circle of poverty is a long, arduous journey. But it is not a dream, it is a choice, and it begins the moment people believe that change is possible and act to make it real. History does not predict our fate, institutions do, and institutions can be changed. Some books explain the world. This one challenges it. Why nations fail is not just about governments or economics. It's about power, about who gets to decide, who gets to dream, and who gets left behind. We often talk about poverty as if it were natural, a storm that just happens. But this book shows us the truth. Poverty is engineered, and if injustice is designed, it can be redesigned. From the plague-stricken fields of medieval Europe to the factories of industrial Britain and the streets of modern Brazil, one pattern repeats. When people claim their voice, systems change. So maybe the question isn't, why do nations fail? Maybe it's, how long will we tolerate the systems that make them fail? If this book changed the way you see power and progress, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe to Lead Reads, where we explore the ideas that shape our world.